Hello and a warm welcome to today's webinar, Circular Economy, Raising Climate Ambition, hosted by the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership and the Global Opportunities for Sustainable Development Goals Initiative and supported by EU funding. I'm Hannes McNulty, Green Industry Platform Manager with the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, or GGKP for short. This is the first webinar in a new series on circular economy that's aiming to accompany the various intergovernmental fora taking place over the coming 12 months. Today's webinar looks towards the upcoming COP28 and aims to answer the question as to how well the circular economy is placed to support the achievement of COP28 objectives and raise climate ambition. It will also highlight the specific contributions that circular economy and its related approaches, such as resource efficiency and sustainable consumption and production, can bring to achieve climate targets. Now, as we are very keen to have your participation throughout this webinar, we really encourage you to submit questions for the speakers throughout the discussion in the dedicated Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Please, therefore, make sure not to use the chat for these types of questions, but rather use it for comments and discussion with the audience. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Stephen Stone, Deputy Director of the Industry and Economy Division with the United Nations Environment Programme. So without further ado, please let me hand the floor over to you, Stephen, to get us going.
Thanks very much, Hannes. Great to be with you all this afternoon. We have a wonderful panel, which is going to walk us through the why and the how of circular economy approaches and what it can offer towards solving the climate crisis. And to kick it off with some welcoming remarks, it is my pleasure to introduce Veronika Thome. Veronika is the head of division at the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety, and Consumer Protection at the Ministry in Germany. So Veronika, some welcoming remarks from you, and then we will introduce our panelists and the great content we have for the discussion this afternoon. Veronika, are you able to put on your camera?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much for the introduction. Hello, everybody. Welcome, everybody. It's hard to welcome people that you don't really see, but I know that there are 115 participants online now. I think that's an excellent turnout and speaks of the importance of the topic. So thank you very much in particular to the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership for having organized this meeting, this webinar on circular and climate change action. I think it couldn't have come at a better moment. Now, a couple of days before COP28 start. I assume one or the other amongst you are already preparing their speaking notes, maybe even already their suitcases. So this is the moment to take input. And a special welcome not only to the participants, but also to the colleagues from the African Circular Economy Alliance, from UNIDO, from ILO, who are joining us as panelists today. Well, we all know that achieving ambitious climate negotiation outcomes is, well, as always, but maybe now even more crucial than ever. Because at this year's COP28, there will be the inaugural global stocktake to be presented, which for the first time will conduct a global assessment of progress toward the Paris Climate Change Agreement goals. We know already that we are not on track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but because we know that, we know also that we have to raise our ambition. And from the committee's side, from the German Environment Ministry's side, BMEV, I can say that we are very much convinced that there is a crucial role for circular economy to play in our global climate change action. And this is why we always, in our negotiations, but also in our communications around climate change action, we stress the role of circular economy and resource efficiency as well. We all know this is widely known that the International Resource Panel has stated half of global greenhouse gas emissions arise from resources extraction and processes. The IPCC affirmed recently this fact and in its latest report on climate change mitigation. So what we need to do is to transition from a linear production model to a circular economy, to a circular use of material resources that require fewer resources and where we use the fewer resources also in a more efficient way. A circular economy conserves energy, it alleviates pressure on ecosystems and reduces polluting emissions, making it thus a crucial approach in addressing the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And this is an aspect that we at the Environment Ministry stress in all different kinds of multilateral negotiations. We try to underline the synergistic solutions that there are. If time is scarce, you have to focus your energy there where you have the most effect on multiple issues. Beyond environmental benefits, circular economy can also help addressing inequalities, instability, and, very important, creating jobs. We have diverse approaches underlining and bringing forward circular economy at the EU level, at the national level, also at G7. During the German G7 presidency in 2022, Germany facilitated the adoption of the Berlin Roadmap for Resource Efficiency and Circular Economy, aiming to advance resource efficiency and circularity across all relevant sectors in G7 countries. So as I said, it is the ambition of my ministry to strengthen the integration and to firmly anchor circularity and resource efficiency in climate and biodiversity policies and negotiations. And this is where this webinar is, in my views, extremely important and extremely timely, because it is easy to say that we have to focus on synergistic solutions. It is much more difficult to advocate for them when we all are active in different kinds of negotiation circles, and often it is not the same people leading the negotiations in the different multilateral contexts. So when we always, well, from the SDG word, you know that we are always claiming to bring down silo approaches. I think this is not only relevant for policy approaches, but particularly relevant for negotiators and for discussion circles. So the aim of this webinar is to bring forward this holistic approach that circular economy necessitates, but also can bring forward. It is a possibility to bring diverse sectors and stakeholders together, and it is extremely difficult, but extremely necessary as well, to build consensus around a common understanding of what circular economy is and on how to achieve it. For a circular transformation of the economy to be successful, there must be high coordination between individual efforts, encompassing targeted awareness raising, cross-sectoral skills development, comprehensive supportive policies, and adaptive financing. So really across the board, very diverse actors, stakeholders, interests have to gather around a common understanding. So Stephen, when you mentioned the how and the why, this is really the questions that all those different stakeholders and actors have to agree upon, or at least have to know from each other what they are talking about, and then try to reach a common understanding, common landing ground from which on then to develop common solutions. There are a lot of organizations and initiatives already working on these building blocks, and we are very happy to have some of them gathered here today to share their perspectives. So let's align the thoughts on the importance and positive impact of circular economy, building a collective voice to push for its central place in intergovernmental negotiations, particularly at COP28 in 1 week. COP28 only marks the beginning of significant upcoming intergovernmental events and negotiations. There's also, well, I mentioned before in the pre-discussion that I was just coming from our internal preparation for UNEA 6, where we want circular economy to be high on the stage as well. Then there will be the World Circular Economy Forum in April. And I assume, we would advocate for circular economy to play also an important role in the G20 negotiations along the year, hosted by Brazil. So again, I can only underline this webinar is perfectly timed. Thank you very much for organizing it, for participating in it. And I'm very much looking forward to an engaged debate. And I hope I was quick and concise enough. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Veronica, for putting a frame around the conversation this afternoon. We are on the eve of COP28. COP28 is just one conversation that's going forward, a very important one on climate. But as you touched upon, circularity can also offer solutions potentially in a pollution space, in a nature space. And so we actually see the conversation today as being relevant beyond climate, certainly for climate, but beyond climate. And Veronica, I'm seeing the chat box exploding with people coming in from around the world, which is really nice, from Nigeria, from Cuba, from Switzerland, from all points of the world. So we have a very good audience. And colleagues, my request to you is please participate in the chat box, in the Q&A. We have a wonderful panel for you today. And so with that, Veronica, I'm going to introduce our panelists who you started to introduce as well. We have with us today Bomwa Fangwaki. She's the program manager for the Africa Circular Economy Alliance, joining us today live and direct from Africa. The African Circular Economy Alliance is part of AFDB, hosted by AFDB. So Bomwa, if you could throw on your camera. We're also joined by Jerome Stuckey. He's the chief of the Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency Unit at UNIDO, the UN United Nations Development Organization, Industrial Development Organization, I should say. And also Sabrina Degobi. She's an economist at ILO, the International Labour Organization. She's going to speak to us about the job implications of circularity and circular economy approaches and how we get the most out of it and how we position ourselves. And last but not least at all, Merlin van Voor. She's the head of the Secretariat, the International Resources Panel, which I believe you mentioned, Veronica, as being one of the definitive sources of science around material flow and resource use. So colleagues, thank you so much for joining today. I wanted to kick it off with sort of a frame, which is a climate frame. I've said it goes beyond climate, but we want to start with climate. The title of the discussion today is around climate. So UNEP put out 3 reports within the past 3 weeks. And if you were watching the space, you would have seen them. One was the adaptation gap report. The second was the production gap report. And the third was the emissions gap report. The adaptation gap report said we are facing a funding gap of around $200 to $350 billion a year in terms of financing adaptation. That means adapting ourselves, our economies, our societies to climate change. The production gap report says we're producing too much fossil fuel, essentially 100% too much fossil fuel if we want to reach the 1.5 degree target. And the emissions gap report, which was launched actually just yesterday, said if we go under business as usual scenarios, even with the NDCs, the nationally determined commitments, we're heading from between 2.5 to 2.9 degrees C plus. So these three gap reports are saying business as usual has us on a very, very preoccupying trajectory. And frankly, we've seen quite a lot of things we didn't want to see this summer. We saw fires, we saw floods, we saw records broken in terms of temperature. So the question I want to ask you is how and why in particular, would we care about circular economy as a potential solution to address some of these issues? And to kick it off, I want to come to you first, Merlin, because I think we need to understand the science and what the science is telling us. And essentially, the question I want to kick it off with you is, what is the science telling us, Merlin, vis-a-vis our material use, its impact on climate, and some of the solutions that might be out there in the circular economy space? Merlin, over to you.
Thanks, Stephen, and good afternoon or good morning. Stephen, I want to start by what you just referenced, which is the reports that you've referenced essentially tells us that inaction is a choice. It's a policy choice. So that's where I'm going to start. If it's a policy choice, then it gives us a sense of why we think the circular economy may be an option to look at the challenges that we're facing. Mm-hmm. And so the research that's just coming out from the International Resources Panel, basically what we're asking is, we're saying that we all know that we need material resources, biomass, fossil fuels, metals, minerals to run the economy. But not just to run the economy, but to provide housing, transportation, etc. I'm really trying to bring it down to those fundamental principles. Mm-hmm. So our report then says that demand for those natural resources, we ask the question, is it increasing? Not surprisingly, it is. Why? Because around the world, cities, meaning our urban populations, are increasing. There's a demand for these services. And then we ask the question, what does that mean in terms of managing our natural resources? And that's a very tricky question because you're having to balance the need for what I'm calling provisioning systems, or what our scientists call provisioning systems, and then balance it with the extraction and the processing of those material resources and the impact on the environment. So what they have found is, no surprise, that there's an increase in demand for these material resources. And at the same time, they can show that the demand for those material resources actually links to the climate agenda. So they can show us that there's apparently a 55% increase in greenhouse gas emissions that comes from extracting these natural resources. So that's one of the scientific evidence that they've provided us with when it comes to extraction. But I think, Stephen, more importantly, they also talk about that it's not just the climate story, as you've just said, it's the biodiversity story, and it's the pollution story. And then ultimately, it's the story about the Sustainable Development Goals and human well-being. So, like many scientists, they provide us with rigorous data. And I'm not going to go into that. I think we can put that into the chat maybe later. But I think from this report, when it comes out in a few months' time, they then say, if we know what the problem is, so if we know, for example, that extracting lithium, which we need for electric vehicles and for energy storage in terms of batteries, what does that mean? What does that demand mean? How can we mitigate that demand? What are the possible options? And one of the options they talk about, coming to your question, is let's look at a circular economy approach. What's interesting about this, Stephen, and you know this, and my fellow panelists who have studied this from an economic side, is that they're saying, let's not only look at the supply side, but let's also look at the demand side. So let's not look at the end, meaning recycling. Let's start at the beginning. Where's the demand? How do you mitigate that? How can we do things differently in the context of circular economy? And I think it would be interesting to get some comments regarding that particular sense that I get from our scientists, where they say, for example, in the case of lithium batteries for electric vehicles, right now it is cheaper to store it in lithium batteries. So there's an economic factor that makes it cheaper. It doesn't make it right environmentally, but the reality in terms of economics is that it is cheaper. So how do you change that particular dynamic? And then they also say, just to end, is they say, let's look at how do you decrease emissions intensity using a circular economy approach, but at the same time you incentivize the economic benefits, and at the same time you incentivize the SDG goals, which is fundamentally about well-being for all. And they give us a lot of data about the differences between high-income countries, low-income and middle-income countries, and where that demand is coming from. And so I think, Stephen, it's this issue of the circular economy is a valuable choice. Remember, I started by saying, if we don't act, it's a policy choice. But we do have choices. And so we have shown that it is a choice.
Yeah.
And I think as the conversations go, perhaps the question is, our scientists have also asked the question, and they show it in the report, that how can we measure the impact of these circular economy approaches where they have been adopted, so that we can then convince others that it makes sense economically and for social and other reasons. Thanks, Stephen.
Merlin, that's a great segue to our next speaker, who is Benoit. Benoit Fuenqual, probably not getting your name entirely right, correct, Benoit. But, you know, as someone who's representing the Africa Circular Economy Alliance in Africa, it's interesting to know, you know, what Merlin's just touched on. So we know globally we have a circularity challenge, if we can put it like that. We know that we're using 100 billion tons of resources and less than 10% is cycling back. So 90% is being burned, emitted, whatever, creating a lot of CO2 and a lot of other waste products, essentially. But in the case of Africa, what is the interest? Why would an African country look at circular economy approaches as being part of their solution set for, say, example, the climate challenge? What's in it?
Okay, thanks, Stephen. And thanks to Marilyn and Veronica that have nicely laid the stage for this conversation. And I like your question on why should Africa, be interested in the circular economy, especially when you make the links to climate change and also considering also that Africa is not a large contributor to GHG emissions. We're not contributors to the emissions, but unfortunately, we seem to be bearing quite a huge brunt from those actions. We're very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And this has caused us to be highly exposed. It has made us quite fragile, and also due to low adaptive capacities that we have on the continent. Sometimes it doesn't make sense why we should be at that receiving end, but it's the reality we're facing. And those were some of the conversations and the thinking that started even behind the creation of the African Circular Economy Alliance. But beyond us being vulnerable, there's also opportunities that we can latch onto by adopting circular approaches. One is, Marilyn mentioned the case for a green transition, making use of lithium batteries and also the electric vehicles. But if you look back, you would see that most of the resources or the raw materials are from the African continent. And so Africa is, giving out the resources, but then importing as consumers, which is, not supposed to be the case. And also, in order to cut down on emissions and for a just transition, it makes sense for these industries. And that's why there's lots of conversations why Africa should be that next frontier for the setup of these green industries. So it's all the thinking. If there's going to be the setup of these industries in Africa, there's a need to create quality jobs for the African youth on the continent, considering, the continent is made up of a very large youth population. So those are some of the thinking. How do we ensure that things are done in the right way so that we're not towing the part of our predecessors where we just adopt the linear economies? So going the circular way, is a nice approach, is a good approach, so that we don't end up being huge contributors to the global greenhouse gases, like is the case now. So there's potential, there's opportunities, but there's deep-rooted issues that Africa is currently facing. Some of the issues also range around poverty that the continent is facing. And even if you're looking to transition, because it's global conversations, if we're looking to transition to a circular economy, then this model would also help address some of these deep seated issues of poverty, lack of employment, and then some issues. I think it was Veronica that mentioned the growing population and the need to catch up in terms of infrastructure that is needed. So there's a lot of issues that I think we need one webinar to explore all the issues that Africa is facing. But it's putting this positive lens as to if we're, as Africa, what makes sense for us. And that's why the co-chairs ideated the idea of the Circular Economy Alliance, because we want Africa to transition to a circular economy that creates jobs for the population, that aids economic development, but also contributes to environmental preservation. Considering also that we are not, even though we're not a huge contributor at the moment. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. I know when Sabrina comes on, she can give some brief on, what the jobs should be in the transition and the rest. Yeah, so thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Boma. Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about resource efficiency, because at the heart of circularity is probably efficient use of resources. And my experience is when countries have low levels of income, they're very efficient with their resources, or at least they have an incentive to be very efficient because they don't have any slack, they don't have any room to sort of waste resources. And I wonder if that same sense of frugality, of efficiency, can be part of the development pathway that African countries are embracing as they start to tap into their very rich resource base as well. But Boma, I'll come back to you. I'll let you think about that one. And I want to actually segue from what you put on the table to Jerome. Jerome Stuckey, so you've mentioned, Boma, the business case for circularity and circular economy approaches. particularly in the development, the industrial development of Africa. Africa is on the verge of creating more value added, particularly from the mineral base that Africa is looking at for the critical energy transition and the critical minerals transition. Jerome, I want to come over to you in terms of, what's in it for an industry beyond making a positive contribution to the climate challenge, reducing emissions, by adopting circular economy approaches. What's the experience and the viewpoint from UNIDO?
Thanks, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you from Ghana, same continent as Bonwa. Just maybe to start with, I think for the business sector, for the private sector, the driver will always be the economic driver. And I think that's always the angle that we have to take, and we have to keep in mind when we want to somehow push the private sector into one direction or the other. Of course, we are always aiming at having environmental and social benefits, but from the private sector, the economic angle will always be the first one. And I think, Stephen, you are absolutely right in saying that resource efficiency is at the heart of circular economy. And if you allow me just to go back to what was said previously, we have a triple planetary crisis. But from my perspective, of course, it's very important to focus on each of these crises, but they are also very much interrelated. And one of the common root causes that they have is the inefficient use of resources. And that's why I believe that it's really important for the private sector also to not look only at energy efficiency and cutting emissions, but actually to look at the whole way that they are using resources. So from my perspective, the discussion at the global level on the three planetary crises, they are actually very much linked also to how the private sector should look at its operations. And if we are talking about resource efficiency, the simple fact that a private sector entity is generating waste should be perceived as a loss of resources, and this has a financial cost. So I think it's important also for the private sector to understand that their business is not just happening in their factories. They have to think about designing for circularity from the start of the whole process. Where are we going to get our resources? How are they going to be extracted? Because that's also an environmental footprint on biodiversity, but also on climate change. Is it linked to deforestation and so on? So I think it's important really to have this circularity element at the heart of any business development and the development of any product. And again, I think often when we approach private sector entities, SMEs in various countries where we operate, as long as they make a profit, they don't really consider waste as an issue. Of course, if they are not generating waste, they don't have to pay for the management of that waste, which is another economic benefit that they see. But I think what is often also not really perceived is that while the material is going through the production process, there is a lot of energy that goes into it to heat it, to transport it here and there. And this is an additional energy loss. So I think by saving and being more efficient on the way you're using material resources, you're of course also contributing positively to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, not just on the energy bill, but the whole energy that is required to somehow process the material. So again, I think from a business perspective, adopting more circularity makes absolutely sense simply by using the resources more efficiently.
And thank you so much, Jerome, and thanks for patching in today from Ghana. I know that that's really appreciated. I'm going to come back to you in the second session about a little bit of the how, what kind of barriers you might face around that. But before I do so, I want to come to our fourth panelist, who is Sabrina. Sabrina Degobi is an economist with ILO. And Sabrina, you've already heard from Bomwa, youth, jobs, skills, some of these questions that are about the now. So what do we do right now about a large youth demographic that's looking for jobs? But it's also about the future. What kind of opportunities are you seeing? Why would we think about circular economy approaches as being part of the solution set around the jobs and the employment questions?
Yes, thank you, Stephen, and a good day, a wonderful day to all of our participants today, very many. Yeah, very good question. From the ILO perspective, the main point, the main advantage of going for the circular economy is that it creates jobs. It does. My colleagues here at the research department, Stephen, in 2018, published a report on green jobs, and they estimated, so we're talking about 2018, they estimated then by 2030, between 7 and 8 million jobs could be created through the circular economy. That's a big number. And now my colleagues are working on a new version of this report that will come out next year, where these figures will be updated. So that's our main advantage in terms of jobs. Now, Marlene at the beginning was mentioning measuring the impact. That's what we're trying to do. We're measuring the impact of some forms of circular economy. I am myself responsible for a project on industrial symbiosis in developing countries. Industrial symbiosis, for those of you who are not familiar with this expression, is a specific form of circular economy where really, simply speaking, the waste of one company becomes input for the production of another company. That's very, very basic definition, very simple. And we conducted some country studies in a number of countries, including 2 African countries, Benin and South Africa. Those studies are ongoing. And we see that if we consider the impact on a value chain level, there's a job increase of, for example, in South Africa, focused for the textile value chain, an increase of 26%, and for the construction value chain, 36%. We did the same estimate cell calculations in Argentina using 2 different value chains. Dairy product, a job increase of 20%, and forest value chain and wood production value chain had a job increase of 52%. So we create jobs, and we are trying, Marlene, to measure impact, as you rightly said. That's what we have to do. If we measure impact, then we can show the advantages of having a circular economy. So mainly, yeah, my first reaction to your question, Stephen, is that the circular economy creates jobs. Now, moving to Mbuma's question or issue, jobs, employment, yes, but then how about the quality of these jobs? In fact, unfortunately, what we call green jobs tend to be of a poor quality, okay? So often informal jobs. For example, in South Africa, since we were talking about Africa, in South Africa, many of these jobs, particularly when we talk about waste pickers, that they are in the informal economy. And we need to improve the working conditions of the jobs that can be created through the circular economy. And that can certainly be done by skills. Normally, let's say that jobs of poor quality tend to be those entailing a low skill levels. Okay, so if we organize training, then we can perhaps improve the working conditions of these workers that could find better jobs with higher skills levels, and therefore better quality jobs. That's my first reaction, Stephen, to your question.
Super.
If you want to know more.
Well, I do want to push you a little bit further on the industrial symbiosis question,
Yes.
because, we're sort of zooming in on Africa. That's not on purpose. It's just because Benoit is part of our panel today. But, if you were starting fresh as a country without a lot of industrial infrastructure, would you go for industrial symbiosis, or is it, not a good investment because you're starting off from scratch?
Well, you have to stretch the notion of industrial symbiosis and adjust it, okay? You have to adjust. In fact, As I mentioned, I think one of our country studies is in Benin. Benin has a very special model, which is called the Songhai model. You may have heard of it. It's based on agriculture, really. It's zero waste. Essentially, that's what we have to go. You know, it's a very stretched definition of industrial symbiosis here, because there's simply not well. It's if you like, a very basic agro-based industry, okay? But there are some food production companies, and you know, it's agriculture, and we can measure the employment impact of that type of scheme. So that's how we do it there.
Okay, very interesting. Towards zero waste. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind. If your economy is increasingly circular, you're probably producing less waste because you're keeping the resources in flow longer. And then the question is, how do you create jobs out of doing that rather than a linear flow, which is sort of a waste producer? And you've started to allude to that, Sabrina. And I want to come back in the second round to you again in terms of the how. How do we actually pin this down? But before coming to you, Sabrina, I want to come back to Benoit. Benoit, for the case of Africa again, you know, the Africa Circular Economy Alliance, it's been around for a little bit. It's associated with the African Development Bank, so it's part of an investment framework, if I could put it like that. What seems to be working for you in Africa, Benoit? What are some of the lessons learned that you're seeing in terms of how to adopt circularity approaches that might have a climate benefit, they might have a nature benefit, and they might have a pollution benefit?
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, for the African Circular Economy Alliance, I mean, it's a platform of governments for governments. So the governments are the owners of the alliance. Yeah, they take the lead of the alliance. The AFDB is the hosting institution. So in that arrangement, they identified 3 interventions. Those are the governments. It was Nigeria, Rwanda, and South Africa that co-founded the alliance. And the 3 interventions revolved around policy support for countries, because policies create that enabling environment for whatever initiative you'd want to implement. There's also support for businesses. And if you look particularly to the African case, SMEs, or the small and medium-sized enterprises, constitute a major bulk of the economy. So about, I think, 50 to 70% of the backbone of the economy is hinged on SMEs. So the question is, how do we ensure that these SMEs adopt the circular approaches, but not to the point where they just remain as SMEs, but are able to scale up? So those are some of the considerations that were made. And the third angle was looking at continuous advocacy of the circular economy. Because I think you mentioned earlier that Africa, we have the circular practices, but the question is, do we know to the extent of the value that this circular economy poses for the African continent? I'm not sure we do. We had to just adopt doing it because of the matter of lack. So we had to ensure that materials stayed in use for longer, because, I mean, we couldn't afford to not do it that way. But then now there's a core value that the circular economy presents. So the question is, how do we ensure that the right stakeholders are aware of this value? So that's one of the approach. But to start off at that umbrella level, we did a research, and this research was hinged on a couple of criteria that is beneficial also to the African continent. So we looked at environmental factors, social factors, factors that will lead to transformational objectives being met, and also what we were seeing, the talk that we were seeing, because circular economy was emerging. And we arrived at 5 core thematic areas. That's plastics, packaging, or packaging, the electronics stream. There's also food systems, considering how important agriculture is to the continent, the built environment, and then fashion and textiles. So starting out at that broad level, thinking of policies, how do we ensure that there are good policies? But then engaging with the governments, we realized that, I mean, some activities were happening in silos, that coordination was not there. So the consultation brought up the lesson that, I mean, the starting phase for these countries will be to create national circular economy roadmaps. So we've gone on the alliance with support from a facility that has been launched within the AFDB, called the African Circular Economy Facility, that has seed funding from the Nordic Development Fund and the Finnish government to begin to support countries to create these roadmaps. But then there's also the bit on how do we even start ensuring that within these identified streams, there are effective policies that will aid the scale-up and the build-up of industries within these areas. And consultations also led to, there's a need for harmonization of policies on the African continent so that there's easy flow of secondary stock to, create large industries, because as it stands, investors are skeptical of investing if they are not assured of economies of scale being met. So there's conversations now going on with African Standards Organization to ensure that we have policies for example, RPET standard. And someone might question and say, oh, recycling is not a preferred principle of circular economy. But we on the African continent have to deal with the realities that are on ground. We have a huge waste population line. There's no good infrastructure to be able to manage this waste. And so those are some of the things that we're dealing with. And like they say, waste is wealth. So how do we ensure that this waste that is lying around is being converted into good wealth? So having structures in place or enablers to be able to facilitate the build-up of industries was one of the thinking behind that. I know I don't have a lot of time. I can go on and on because I was privileged to be part of the conversation when the Secretariat of the Alliance was set up. There's also the business support angle too. How do we ensure that these SMEs are supported? How do we ensure that financing trickles down to them? Because at the end of the day, traditional banks are asking for crazy interest to be able to afford these businesses with the funding they require. There's also a case where they're asking for collaterals that are not feasible. So how do we ensure that conversation is done in such a way that the right amount of funding gets trickled? There's a lot of talk about circular economy, but the funding that is coming through is not matching the level of talk that is going on. So those are some of the considerations we are making on the Alliance and how we're engaging with stakeholders to get activities started. And then continuously on the advocacy end, trying to get other members on board of the transitional journeys, hosting events and webinars like this and the rest. So I'll stop here so I don't take up the whole time in the conversation. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Bonwa. No, it's really, really good to hear you speak. And, I'm glad you're sort of hitting some of the questions that are appearing in the chat box as well. There was a specific question by someone who wanted to know the role of government in a circular economy and how governments can support a circular economy. You touched on that a little bit in your remarks. And then the other question there was, other than funding, what are some of the significant challenges that businesses or the private sector are encountering? And what I'd like to do for all the panelists is encourage you to look into the Q&A box, because there's some that are directed to individuals. They actually have your names there. To our audience, I would encourage you to keep putting your questions into the chat box, because I'm going to try to pepper our panelists with them as we go along. And I'm going to pass over from you, Bonwa, to Jerome again. And Jerome, drilling down, Bonwa's put the issue of SMEs out there, small and medium-sized enterprises, but also the scaling. How do you scale up from SMEs with circular economy approaches? And I'd like to ask you that question in very practical terms, perhaps what you're doing as you're connecting with us from Ghana, I think it was, but also in terms of the climate benefits, the co-benefits that you're seeing that would raise climate ambition. Why would a circular economy approach to SMEs help the climate and help the SME itself? Jerome, back over to you. A little bit of the how.
Thanks, Stephen. Let me take a few examples maybe from the initiatives that we are running, because I think we have, of course, we are working both on the climate change aspect with some initiatives that are targeting, for example, the decarbonization of hard-to-abate industries. I'm thinking about steel and cement enterprises that are not necessarily SMEs, of course, but I think we have that angle. We have also a lot of projects where we are supporting SMEs in their efforts to improve their efficiency and their circularity. But I think when we talk about bringing the two together, I think there is, for example, the topic of the construction sector, which is a sector that is really ready to I think get more attention from both the circular economy community, but also the deep decarbonization. And on that front, of course, there are a lot of efforts to try to decarbonize again the steel, cement producer, concrete producers. But if we look at it from a circular economy perspective, I think Benoit was just mentioning some of the key sectors that are typically targeted: the plastics, the textile, electronics, and so on. But actually, in terms of materials, quantity of materials that are being consumed, sand and gravel is the largest quantity. So I think this is a sector where UNIDO is gradually getting more and more involved also, and where there are clearly benefits from both the circular economy perspective in terms of resource efficiency, environmental and social benefits, but same thing for the decarbonization of the sector. Maybe going back to the first part of your questions on the support to SMEs, and also looking at some of the question in the Q&A, I think because our economies are so interlinked and complex, it's important to have integrated approaches. So it's important to have, from the government perspective, supporting policies, regulations, incentives, maybe also removing some indirect disincentive to circular economy. And then you need to have a whole ecosystem that will be supporting that. So this could be consulting companies, but also access to finance. We've heard also the challenges for the SMEs to access this financing, and this is something that we are also working on. As you mentioned, I'm here in Ghana. We are supporting the establishment of a circular economy center that will specifically target women-led and youth enterprises, specifically because there is this gap currently in access to finance for this type of SMEs. So it's important, I think, to also focus on that enabling environment, if you want, and then of course capacity building, because I think we are all aware in that panel in this community of the importance of circular economy. But I think in terms of raising awareness, building the capacity, there is still a lot of room there to provide support and promote resource efficiency, circular economy, also for climate benefits. So that's what we are trying to do. We are trying to have approaches that are working at the government level, at this meso level, with the enabling environment, the supporting business organization. But our main clients, if you want, our targets, beneficiaries are always the SMEs, because that's where a lot of innovation is also taking place. There is really a strong energy, plenty of great ideas, and it's important to have incubators and various platforms that are helping these SMEs to grow, because they have the solutions. Sometimes they need our support to just go to the next scale. Yeah, I think that's really important to look at all these elements and have these integrated approaches to be able to contribute, of course, to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but also at more circularity. And one last point, if you allow me, Benoit was mentioning the waste management issue and the recycling, and I absolutely agree. There are huge needs, and I think it's important to deal with it. But of course, my recommendation, working for UNIDO, would always be to try to focus also on reducing the generation of waste. We need to manage what is already being produced, but we need also to focus on reducing the generation of waste, so that gradually we will have less and less waste, and actually more and more byproducts that are being circulated again in the economy. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really it, isn't it? Keeping the resources in the economy, adding value in the economy as they flow through, rather than like a one-way conveyor belt to the rubbish bin, which happens a lot. Taking your point around the optimism, the enthusiasm, the innovation, the opportunities with SMEs, I want to go to you, Sabrina, on the labor side, because what is required in terms of the skills and the capacities, particularly at the SME level, but not exclusively, to build that circular economy of the future? What kind of skills are required?
Yeah, so my colleagues who deal specifically with skills are trying to map those skills. Essentially, if you talk about waste pickers or those in charge of screening, collecting, screening, and cleaning waste, well, those are very, very basic skills. Okay, so essentially, just a little bit of on-the-job guidance would put a worker in a position to be performing well in his tasks. In my industrial symbiosis case studies, the findings I gathered are that the circular economy, in our case, requires skills of all levels. So you have low skills, like I said, for waste pickers or waste screeners and cleaners, but you also have high skills levels. For example, as Jerome was saying, you need to also work on, for example, on designing products. Okay, so you have eco designers, and those are high level skills. But then you need environmental engineers. You need also digital developers. So essentially, those people that can track the needs of waste of one company for its production and the type of waste that another company can offer. So they match companies so that they can exchange waste essentially. Yeah? And those are very, very high skills levels. Then you also need managers, managers in companies that are not only, they have not only economics as a strength, but also environmental skills or some environmental knowledge. So economics and environmental, say, protection should be combined together, so that if you have managers that can understand what is going on and can understand how the circular economy functions, then you can really have a stronger circular economy going on.
So I'm just going to go a little deeper there, Sabrina. We know it's a common challenge. I mean, Europe is trying to go circular, Japan, a lot of countries are struggling with it, and a lot of it seems to do with labor transitions, because it's hard to reskill sometimes. How do you see that? Are there any successful cases out there where you've seen an industry essentially transform itself to become non-polluting? For example, I'm thinking of the coal transition, for example, but there must be others where you're actually retraining an entire segment of the labor force.
Well, yes, in those cases, you need active labor market policies. So the government, a few questions were about the government intervention. What should the government do? How about policies? Well, definitely, that's key. Okay, that's key. So the government can push for the circular economy by adopting policies. And for example, Colombia is a good case of a country with a circular economy policy, and there you see clear results. But also governments in general should come up with labor market active labor market policies or programs where they organize training for those workers that are dismissed and needs to be reskilled essentially. Yeah? And so that's where, again, my colleagues who are dealing specifically with skills are interacting with governments precisely to figure out how these workers can be reskilled and in which areas, because of course you need to know in an economy which areas are in need of labor force, of workers. Yeah. So I would say that the government has a pivotal role to play in training, reskilling, and for a just transition.
Absolutely. So a lot of choices. And Merlin, I'm coming back to you now, because you actually started off your first remarks with, well, there's choices, and science can show trends, consequences, but then there are choices. And, if you had to boil it down, Merlin, in terms of circular economy approaches that are good for climate, nature, and pollution, what are some of the key policy levers that are out there in terms of making it happen? And going to the question in the chat from Gopal, is there one circular economy national policy for every country now? That's from the chat as well. So Merlin, over to you for some thoughts about how this is done, what the science is telling us.
Yes, I think, Stephen, the reason why we're having this conversation is because we all know that the concept of circular economy is not simple. So question is, how do we then use data and science to convince our policymakers? Our policymakers pass laws, they make regulation, they issue standards. And it sounds simple, but as you know, having followed the negotiations around the plastics agenda, which is a similar kind of very complicated set of issues, which is how do we deal with plastics? How do we convince our regulators, our policymakers, to set standards so that this issue of plastics that's polluting our environment, etc., you know that story. And so for the IRP, when we produce our research, Stephen, it really is about saying these are the impacts. And we are talking to, first of all, the people who can make change. And the people who can make change, for example, the EU has guidance on circular economy. Benoit, you said that, there's efforts underway also to start putting in place, hopefully, some kind of way to look at circular economy to address the demand for natural resources and what that means, particularly for countries that are rich in those resources. So that's one. There's the policymakers. And I think, Stephen, for me, without getting into the technicalities of our scientific and our technical findings, which is very robust, I think the issue is that, like plastics, we do rely on natural resources. It's ubiquitous. And so our challenge, which is the question that we all grappling with, Jerome has said it, Sabrina has said it, and you have said it, Benoit has said it, and other colleagues, is then how do we convince our policymakers? And then how do we convince consumers? So in that regard, in terms of this global resources outlook that will come out in February, we've tried to take a lot of the data that's coming out, and we have targeted to 3 specific audiences. Business, Jerome, you said, if you cannot convince people about an economic argument, you may not get where we think we should be. So we're doing a specific product for business. Then we're working particularly with young people, and we haven't even spoken about that. I don't know who's the youngest on this panel, by the way, but I do think from a consumer perspective, that is so important. And then we're also talking to, as I said, our policymakers. And I'll leave it there because, and then I'll come back to, we describe, hopefully, what are the indicators that we think governments can use to monitor how well they are doing. It's one thing to say, do something, and it's another thing to say, you know what, we think if you do these things in terms of your material consumption and your material footprint. And these are the resource indicators, and you can actually monitor it and hopefully identify the impacts in terms of certain indicators. Then maybe we will get to the beginning of my story, which is inaction doesn't have to just be inaction. It is a choice, and we want people to make that choice.
You know, and Merlin, I'm going to the chat now. There was this question from Gopal Krishna, and he was saying, "Dear Merlin, you know, do you think that circular economy should be a national policy for every country now?" So you've said it's an imperative, it beats policy in action. Is there sort of one circular economy policy for every country, or, you know, how do you see this playing out, actually, to Gopal's question?
I think at the heart of this question is actually the fact that we're having a conversation about circular economy because we understand that the previous model, which is the linear economy, has not actually led to the benefits, economic, social, you name it. And that's why we're having the conversation. It's not an esoteric discussion. It's because we're saying the linear economy has not been able to take us to where we should be. You know, it's not the circular economy and Stephen woke up one morning and thought, great idea. No, people really have put a lot of thought into that and said, we've had the linear economy, and where should we be? Is there something that will apply to everybody? Not sure. But we do know in terms of jurisdiction. So it comes, I think the question is, what will the IRP say? The EU, you know, has its way of legislation. In other parts of the world, there's national jurisdictions and federal, if you like. But, you know, the point is, I do think that fundamentally it's about how do we convince people that the old linear economy is not going to take us where we should be.
Yeah. It's kind of saying, going back to the reports, the GAP reports, we're not heading in a good direction. Overall, the science is telling us that, and you're saying the Global Resource Outlook, which will be launched in March of next year, as I understand, at the UNEA 6, is also very much making that case. Boma, I want to come back to you actually with this question from Gopal, because, you know, the Africa Circular Economy Alliance, how do you see this playing out country by country? Is each country developing their own pathway based on their own endowments, or are you seeing some commonalities between the countries that are pushing towards circular economy in Africa as part of the alliance?
Okay, I mean, so as the alliance, I mentioned earlier, we have the 5 big bets, but this is at an African level. It's different for each country, even though, I mean, there will be similar sectors of focus. So what we encourage all countries to start with is to have that roadmap for themselves, where they identify priority sectors for their countries, as well as stakeholders, because a lot of times people speak about the circular economy and they limit it to the Ministry of Environment. I mean, granted that within the alliance, our focal points are the Ministries of Environment, but we want it to just stop at the word focal points because there's a need to collaborate with other ministries as well. So identifying which ministries are relevant for the roadmap that you're charting for yourself. So do you need to engage with the Ministries of Trade, the Ministries of Agri, the Ministry of Finance? So, I mean, having to identify those stakeholders that are relevant for each country is really important. So I would say, I mean, there's that umbrella at the Africa level that gives the platform for sharing of best practices and also engaging for the good of the continent as well. But it's really important for countries to drill down to their specific cases. Yeah.
Thanks. So it sounds like it's not a one size fits all, but there are some commonalities, and then each country needs to think about their own pathway, investment pathway, policy pathway. I'm going to another question in the chat box, which is from Kien Nguyen Van. And Jerome, I'd like to see if you'd want to take a crack at this. It's, how do you develop a network, call for interest, realizing through research and application, mobilize resources PPPs. I assume that means public-private partnerships, as well as change awareness and action. So in other words, what are some of the levers that we have, countries have, the UN agencies have, people who want to see this happen? What are some of the levers that we have at our disposal to take a circular economy approach forward?
Thanks, Stephen. I will try to do my best, but I think it might be better to ask Benoit since it's about a network or an alliance. But I think generally speaking, I mean, to have something that is functioning, you need to have a few champions, a few entities that are driving the network. Ideally, also from different entities, government entities, private sector, because I think Benoit was very correctly mentioning the importance of involving all the relevant ministries. And I think since we are talking about economy, like all our lives and the different aspects of our societies are somehow related to economy. So I think for such a network to function, it's of course, except if it's a specialized network of, let's say, private sector entities, I think if we really want to have a successful network, it's important to involve governments, but also NGOs, private sector partners, because again, since we are talking about circular economy, but economy mainly, we need to involve all these different key stakeholders. Yeah. When it comes to mobilizing resources, I think that's sometimes a different challenge. But I think generally that it's not really the lack of resources that is the issue, but it's how these resources can go and reach the actual stakeholders that need these resources. And that's not necessarily through networks, but again, through these different business sector kind of meso level type of actors that can facilitate the flow between the financing that is available and the beneficiaries. And the final point, I think, is it's already mentioned in the question, but it's about awareness raising. This is very a critical element for any network, would be to have a lot of communication and visibility, to provide information. We heard that there are many reports that are available, but I think it's important still to promote these reports so that it can reach the widest audience as possible. So in a nutshell, that's how I would go about it.
Thank you very much, Jerome. That was brilliant. And you know, I saw Adriana Zacharias threw something in the chat as well about Go for SDGs, global opportunities for the SDGs, as being a network that's very active in the space of circular economy. And there are links there in the chat that Adriana put in. I also wanted to mention, Jerome, a partnership that you are co-hosting with UNEP called the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency. Maybe you could say one or two words about that. And what's the relationship between this Global Alliance and the African Alliance? How do they work together?
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, indeed, we do work together because the Africa Circular Economy Alliance is a member of GACER, actually not a member, a strategic partner, because the alliance is an alliance of like-minded governments that want to promote circular economy and advocate for circular economy. So UNEP and UNIDO, we are providing secretariat services for that alliance. We are inviting any government that is interested in joining that effort to join the alliance. There is no legally binding constraints. It's purely a political decision from a government to join or not the alliance. And we have a set of strategic partners that are providing advices to the work of the Global Alliance for Resource Efficiency and Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency. And I saw also in one of the questions about ICLEI, which is a network of local government municipalities working on circular economy. And ICLEI, for example, is also a strategic partner of GACER. So the purpose here is really to generate also knowledge, raise awareness, develop some products, having some webinars, also focusing on circular economy and various topics related to circular economy.
Thanks very much, Jerome, for spelling that out for us. Bonwa, I want to come back to you, number one, because Jerome really pointed out that you are the network when it comes to Africa, but also for that relationship that you're seeing between the Global Alliance and the Africa Alliance. And how do you build on those alliances, the ones that you've created regionally, the ones that are there globally, for individuals, including those who are in the audience that are asking, how do I get involved? What can I do to take this forward where I am?
I mean, the African Circular Economy Alliance is open to all 54 plus one African countries. So, I mean, there's a charter you just need to sign. It's a fairly easy process. There's no payments of any fees to join the alliance. It's free. So it's a platform for exchange. And the good thing with being a country member of the alliance is that we get to engage with other partners like GASERE, where we do North-South collaboration, the Latin America Coalition too, where there's South-South collaboration as well. So there's that good opportunity to share best practices with peers and also tap into what is being done, as well as resources that are available for enhancement of this circular transition on the continental level. Yeah.
Nice. It sounds like a really wonderful space to get more involved with. And, I want to pick up on the youth question that you put onto the table earlier. The demographic in Africa is very interesting because you have so many young people. And I actually want to flip this one over to Sabrina again because of ILO's role with jobs and skills. And Sabrina, I know you're also involved in something called the Green Jobs for Youth Pact, which speaks to youth training. I wonder if you could just say a few words. What is this Green Jobs for Youth Pact? What is it and how does it work?
I can provide more details later on, but it is certainly an effort that the ILO is making towards creating a youth employment. And there are certainly, as we explained, many opportunities to create jobs in the green economy for the youth. And the ILO has developed, so this program has a large training component, again, on capacity building. The ILO has produced a number of manuals and training tools, in particular to improve the working conditions in the green economy. And these are key for capacity building and the creation of decent work for the youth. There's also one program which is called a SCORE, Sustaining Competitive and Responsible Enterprises. And this particular program has a module on the circular economy. It's a program that focuses on boosting small and medium-sized enterprises it's active in several developing countries. And this is again one major training effort of the ILO. And so the ILO is definitely working on creating jobs for the youth, including in the green economy.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. So it's really interesting to see some of these policy choices that are out there, right? Are you investing in skills? Are you investing in the infrastructure? Are you investing in the policy framework that can enable some of these solutions to come forward to unlock and unleash the entrepreneurialism in the private sector? I think what you referred to, Jerome, is that engine of innovation that is SMEs. I actually want to give Veronica, I want to give you a heads up as we come to near the end of the program, because I'd like to invite you back in, Veronica, to help us take stock of what we've heard today. You mentioned earlier in the conversation a number of different programs and platforms and networks that are all working in this space. And we've heard from some of them now. We've heard from a lot of them, and I'm seeing the chat actually come alive with others as well. So I'm just going to try to recap a little bit before handing it over to you, Veronica. I want to say that, number one, we've sort of gone on a tour of the world today, because we've seen chats coming in from Nigeria, from Asia, from Latin America, from the Caribbean. There's even some in the chats, I believe it's in Arabic, which unfortunately I can't understand, but I hope they're good comments. I'm sure they're very good comments. We've talked a lot about the role of industry and about industrial symbiosis, as you talked about earlier. And we've talked a lot about how you actually can make a circular economy relevant to countries that are working towards those different solution spaces. What I'd like to do now is bring you back in, Veronica, if you're there, if you could throw on your camera and see if you are there, and you could come in and actually say a few words before we wrap up. I see we're at 4:20, so we still have a little bit of time. And then I'm going to actually come to each of the panelists for your take home from this conversation. So a really quick take home from each of the panelists. But Veronica, first over to you. And the reason I really wanted to hear from you is you talked about this constellation of actors who are out there, and you talked about a time frame of 1 year and many important meetings that are coming up. What kind of direction do you get the sense from this first initial conversation with our GGKP hosted event? What are some of the take homes that you're going to walk away with today?
Stephen, thank you very much. Well, first of all, a big thank you to all the panelists. It's been really inspiring. It's a challenging question, Stephen. What are my main takeaways? But I would say the very first one is this choice issue that was raised. So as so often we know where the solutions are, it is simpler said than done. But it is actually a policy choice to try to benefit from the many advantages that a circular economy can bring in tackling, in attacking multiple crises, but not only as a crisis solution, but really as a modernization aspect of our economy. So the first issue I would say is choice. Or the first takeaway is a political choice. Does a country want to go this way? In Germany, I think I said it in the beginning, we are actually working on our national economy strategy. And we are doing this in a very open and consultative process, or with many diverse stakeholders. I don't know the end result yet. But many of the issues and the levers mentioned here are in it. I think what I also take away is the holistic approach and this issue that not one size fits all, because I think Marilyn said it so rightly. Of course, it is a choice to transition from a linear economy to a circular economy, but in the same way that we don't have all the same linear economy model, we can't have the same circular economy model. So there are certain common elements in it, and therefore peer learning, as happens here and as we want to advocate everywhere, is very important to distill what are learnings that can be transferred from one country to the other. But at the end, it has to be adapted to the specific circumstances. And while I could wrap up a lot, but allow me two things more. One further word is skills. Skills, and I think we often tend to think of skilling of the new generation, or the younger generation, younger people. But I think that's not enough. If we say that we are in a hurry, that we have to transition quickly to a circular economy model, then we have to retrain, reskill the workforce in place now. And I think what we can learn from SME approaches that are, or SME experiences that are often very agile, could also be transferred to the learning of how do you develop learning. So can we learn from SMEs experiences to scale them up, again, an upscale, but into the education and the lifelong learning of the current workforce. That's a different type of partnership. And to end up, I want to, because I think my colleague has already posted it in the chat, but also our ministry is organizing a side event at the COP28 in the German pavilion, and it is more or less also a kind of continuation of this webinar, because we want to focus on the question on how to integrate circular economy in the NDCs. The side event is called Time to Act, Raising Ambition in Climate Change Mitigation through Resource Efficiency and Circular Economy. Takes place on the 10th of December around lunchtime, and features not only our minister, but also Janusz Potocznik and Jim Skier. That was my advertising block. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And thanks again. I've learned so much. Thank you very, very much. And I am looking forward to a kind of recording or something like that, because there are some of your interventions, dear panelists, that I would like to re-listen to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Veronica. So anchoring in the COP, as we started with an event about time to act, raising ambition, using circularity approaches, really, really helpful. Skills, but not just youth. Yes, youth, but also retraining skills. Oh, interesting. My lights are down here. It's because I'm not active enough. I'm going to have to move my arms to get the lights back on. That's resource efficiency. And then choice. Merlin, clearly you've made a point that resonates. Colleagues, we are 5 minutes away. I would like to hear from each of the panelists. If you have a very short message to leave with us today. We've now heard from Veronica, but I actually want shorter messages from you, the panelists. And I'm going to actually move backwards from the way that we started in the very, very opening. So that means, Sabrina, to you first. What's the take-home message from today, from your perspective, from the ILO?
Lots of interest in the circular economy, particularly from developing countries. So I think the ILO is going the right direction, focusing on employment impact of circular economy initiatives in developing countries in particular.
Thank you for that. And jobs are clearly so important for everybody, for human dignity and for human development. So I think we need the ILO with us. The ILO, the oldest and the longest serving UN institution. Jerome, going to you, UNIDO, what's the take home today from you from the conversation?
3 quick points. The first one, since this discussion is framed around circular economy and the future COP28, is to remember that resources, it's raw material, it's water, and it's energy. And I think you need to tackle and to consider always the 3 together. The second point is that we need to focus on production, the circularity part, but also on consumption. And I think that's also very important to keep in mind the overconsumption aspect. And my final point is just the importance to involve all the stakeholders along the supply chain or the value chain. Very important for a successful transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. Very pragmatic, very grounded take-home points that will help us get the job done. Benoit, over to you from the Africa Circular Economy Alliance, your take-homes for today and the message you'd like to leave with us.
Okay, I mean, this is supposed to be a pre-COP conversation. So the hopes is that when COP comes and decisions are being made, it's not going to just end with conversation. At least the needle gets pushed for action, for finance flow to the SMEs. And I know Marilyn asked who is the youngest person on the panelist list. I think the probability of me being the youngest is quite high. So I would speak on behalf of the young people. Let's think about the young people as we make decisions. Let's think of just transition for Africa and for the good of the global economy. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. Thank you for that. And thank you for being the voice of the youth and for reminding us that we're heading into a very important conversation at COP28. And we need to make the most of that opportunity. So Merlin, coming to you for the last word. You kicked it off and we're coming back to you now. Your take-home points?
I think for people who have listened to this conversation, and thank you to all our colleagues from BMUV, Veronica, etc., it's clear to me that we are people who understand why we need to rethink the way we do things. And so now the next challenge is implementation beyond what we have. Just listening to this, it's not going to be easy, but I think it is important. And I can hear from, UNIDO, Jerome, and others that there is a commitment that we have to pursue this line, knowing that it's really going to be extremely complex. I don't want to sound negative. I should end on a positive note.
That's okay, Merlin, because...
But that's my positive note, which is, I fundamentally believe this. I think this is a fantastic opportunity. We're trying to change the debate and the way we think about the world's economy. And it's not going to be easy. And we can show examples, and the implementation is going to be the hard part, unfortunately.
So that's where the rubber hits the road. And coming from somebody who is so immersed in science and leading the International Resources Panel, I think that's a great way to end, because you are leading us along the science pathway. But what you're really saying is, after the science, we need to put it into practice and get things done. And that's really been the spirit of the conversation today. So Hannes, colleagues, I would like to thank you for hosting us today on the GGKP platform. You've done a brilliant job of bringing us together. I'd like to thank Veronica and all the colleagues at BMUV who have been supporting GGKP and the whole process of our exploring circularity and circular economy approaches, and wishing you all the best for COP28 and beyond as we move into the next year. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, and safe travels for all of you who are going to COP.